My name is Jared K. Smith, and I'm on the government relations team at Network Lobby for Catholic Social Justice. I want to welcome everyone to our webinar today. A little housekeeping before we get started. Please put yourself on mute and turn off your camera if you're not speaking. If you have any questions, put them in the chat and we will answer them later in the program. Today's guests are Rabbi Pesner and Reverend Dr. Georgia Thompson. Later, they will be introduced by my colleagues. The theme of our web series is atoning for injustice and building a future together. We gather every third Wednesday. Our goal is to educate people of faith in order to actively apply the education to change this world into the vision that God deserves. Meaning to educate so we collective and individually can do something so that we could make a difference. Last month's webinar featured Minister Christian Brooks, who gave an incredible explanation on equity, equality, and repair. And she also talked about the racial wealth gap, and she gave some actual proposals for us to close it. In that webinar, we also heard from Dr. Ivor Carruthers. It was a fantastic presentation, and she talked about the global reparatory justice movement. Today, we will hear more about the global reparatory justice movement. This is the second part of our web series on reparatory justice. We hope to see you in April for our next webinar on housing, land, and debt. So let me thank some of our sponsors who helped put this webinar together for us. That includes the National Council of Churches, United Church of Christ, Presbyterian Church USA, Church World Service, Religious Action Center of Reformed Judaism, the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference, the Episcopal Church, Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, Network Lobby for Catholic Social Justice, and others that have helped bring this webinar forward. Please take an opportunity to watch some of our previous webinars. I asked my colleagues to put the link in the chat. And I welcome each and every one of you today to today's webinar. And don't forget, if you have any questions, to put them in the chat and we will answer them. Oh, I'm told to put them in the Q&A window, not the chat, but the Q&A window. So I will turn to my colleague, Israel, and he will introduce our first guest, Rabbi Pesner. Thank you.
Thank you, Jarrett. Hi, everyone. Thank you again so much for coming. My name is Israel Harris. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I'm a legislative assistant at the Religious Action Center of Reformed Judaism. I'm really grateful for being a part of this group and webinar series and the opportunity to continue involving the Jewish community and the RAC as active members of the reparations movement. And today I have the pleasure of introducing my director, Rabbi Jonah Pesner, who is a leader, an activist, an educator, and wears a number of different hats in the Jewish Reform movement, which expands to over 800 congregations across North America, around 1.8 million Jewish members, and more than 2,000 Reform rabbis. As a member of the legislative team at the RAC, I have been so lucky enough to work alongside Rabbi Pesner on a number of issues that we cover. which includes our work on reparations, of course. And as the Reparatory Justice Faith Table, we as a group come to this work through our faith perspective. So today, Rabbi Pesner will be grounding us in our teachings as we explore reparations in this country and globally. So Rabbi Pesner, I will pass it over to you.
Thank you so much, Israel Harris. You are a fantastic leader of our Reformed Jewish movement. We're honored to have you as one of the legislative assistants working on reparations, working on racial justice, and a variety of other social justice issues. You've been such a star. And for those that may not have seen, in the previous webinar, Israel did a beautiful teaching around the primary rabbinic theological grounding of reparations in the story of the beam. So I want you to go back, rewatch that webinar if you didn't, or watch it if you did, and learn from Israel. I want to thank this whole reparations interfaith table. It's an honor to be the leading Jewish organization and denomination at the reparations movement table. We take this work deeply seriously. It is a blessing to see all of our inter-Christian allies and to invite in all peoples of all faiths to join us, and the secular groups as well. We're deeply proud that the Reformed Jewish movement in 2019 became the first most significant either organization or denomination in Jewish life to call for reparations for the descendants of African enslaved peoples and to demand accountability for the history of 400 years, not only the enslavement of African people and the kidnapping, but then the 400 years that included Jim Crow, segregation, mass incarceration, voter suppression, and so much more that has led to the radical inequalities and inequities that demand a call for reparation. And again, for those who didn't see the first session, a brilliant teacher shared the understanding, the distinction between equality, equity, and reparations. And it's important to get our arms around the actual restorative justice that can happen when reparations for the enslavement of African people and the reparations to their descendants can be done. And this country, the United States, can actually confront its own history. Today, our theme is going to be global. So I will do some theological framing around building on Israel's teaching around the Jewish call to reparations that hopefully will center ourselves for the work we as US citizens and as Americans need to do to hold the US accountable. But then the Reverend Doctor will take a broader frame and will telescope out to the global movement for reparations. In that spirit, I have to lift up a name that our hearts are breaking for the people, the innocent victims of the militant aggression happening in the Ukraine. The pictures that those of us saw today who saw the head of Ukraine, Zelensky, share in the video, the graphic images of children and so many bodies being tossed into mass graves. It feels like another genocide, like another Holocaust. And so our hearts break with the people of Ukraine. And to acknowledge that even amidst this terrible atrocity, there continues to be anti-Black and anti-Brown racism, because we see reports at the borders of asylum seekers, people coming from the Black and Brown nations, African nations in particular, that were already displaced and had sought asylum and refuge in Ukraine, are now displaced yet again and are experiencing racism and bigotry at the borders as they seek to make their way in their journey. So it's a reminder that as we think about what possible restoration could be done in the military aggression in Ukraine, we once again see the ways in which our globe is sick and infested with an anti-Black and Brown racism, a white supremacy that can only be overcome, not only when we beat back bigotry, but when we actually repair, we do the restorative work that I will now reflect on from a theological perspective. In 2019, when the Reform movement, the Reformed Jewish movement, formally ratified our commitment to reparations, it came in the context of our 70 years as the central Jewish entity in the civil rights movement. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the Civil Rights Act of 1964 were drafted in the conference room of the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism. In the decades since then, Reform Jews have been central to the racial justice movement in this country, culminating in the Black Lives Matter movement, as we were very clear, as Black Lives Matter as a Jewish value in the context not only of Freddie Gray and Tamir Rice and Sandra Bland, and then later George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and so many more, but also in a recognition of the mass incarceration becoming the new Jim Crow, and a recognition of the way in which when Shelby v. Holder rolled back the protections of the Voting Rights Act, once again, we got racialized voter suppression in our country. And here in the US, we've seen this over the last decade as more and more states have, in essence, maintained white supremacy through voter suppression. So a culminating moment in our work for racial justice was to do the deep dive into reparations work and to ratify our commitment not only to fighting for federal legislation here in the US, HR 40, which is the bill that would call and to being a commission to study reparations, but also to challenge our local congregations and communities to look at reparations on a local level. And people could look at Evanston, Illinois as one example of a community that is looking at its own history and trying to do reparations work. When we passed that resolution, the text that we centered was a midrash, and Izzy explained midrash the last webinar. It's the rabbinic interpretations of the biblical text. So these are the stories and the legends that the rabbis told in order to teach off of our biblical text. So in the Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer text, we hear the voice that says, the story that says, nobody should ever be able to say, my ancestor was greater than your ancestor. And why is that? Because when God created the world, God created the first human in the divine's image, and we're all descendants of that first human. In fact, Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer goes on to say, not only can one human not elevate themselves over above another human by saying, my ancestors were greater than your ancestors, the rabbis were very specific. They said, because when God created that first human, God took clay from all four corners of the earth, yellow clay, white sand, black loam, and red soil, all into that one human, so that nobody could say that any person, regardless of their phenotypical exterior appearance, the color of their skin, could be either oppressed or elevated as above any other person of any other color. And I would also recognize that not only did we use that as our framing text for our call to reparations in 2019, that was the story that my predecessor, Rabbi Dick Hirsch, told when he marched in Selma with Dr. King. So it is a core text for us, that understanding that no one group in this world, this beautiful, diverse tapestry with different colors and different phenotypical appearances, could be elevated against another group simply because of the color of skin or any other social construct around race. So our Jewish texts are very clear on this. And why reparations per se, not just racial justice in a broader sense? When Izzy was with you at the last Zoom, he told the story of Hillel and Shammai, who asked the question, when there is a house that has a beam that was stolen, what is to be done in order to rectify the situation? If the beam was stolen and now the house is built, Rabbi Shammai said, well, you have to destroy the entire house and return the beam to the rightful owner. Rabbi Hillel actually had a countering view and said, well, you don't destroy the entire house, but you have to pay financial remunerations of the fair value of what the beam is worth in its current time to the person from whom the beam was stolen, or to the descendants of the people for whom the beam was stolen. So what is this to teach us? Rabbi Sharon Brous drills down even deeper than at first glance. At first glance, we have this notion that in order to do teshuvah, in order to have forgiveness and healing, we have to actually pay financial remuneration to this person who was victimized. But Rabbi Sharon Brous notices that the inclination to tear down the house actually is consistent with Leviticus. Leviticus chapter 5 actually says that when stolen property, when someone steals property, in order for this sin to be rectified, the property has to be returned to its rightful owner. So you would think that the beam should be torn out of the house should be destroyed, and the beam given back. But actually, the prevailing view was Hillel's view, who said, you don't tear down the house, but you do pay reparations. And why? Rabbi Brous says, because in order for us to have teshuvah work, for repentance and repair, we have to make space for humanity to actually do teshuvah, to ask for forgiveness, and then to be forgiven. The work of this reparations movement is to engage the US and the global community in an honest and frank dialogue to say, we're not trying to tear down the house. In fact, HR 40 doesn't even call for reparations. It calls for a commission to study reparations. So we're not trying to tear down the house. We're actually trying to motivate a conversation that will say, what will bring actual equity and repair to the original sin of the US and so much of the global world that we live in, of the enslavement of African people or the other forms of oppression based on race. One last text before I turn it over to my colleague. In Leviticus chapter 25, we hear the story of the Jubilee year. And it's quite a beautiful theological frame that's grounded in the notion, and many of my Christian colleagues will know the psalm that says, the earth belongs to the Lord and the fullness thereof. It's this notion that the planet doesn't belong to humans, that we are just temporary residents on it. So Leviticus 25 takes that very seriously and has a series of rules. Every 6 years, you're allowed to work the land, but on the 7th year, the land has a Shabbat, a Sabbath. That is to say, the land gets to rest just the same way humans get to rest. And by the way, even enslaved people were guaranteed the right to rest on the 7th day in the biblical text. But it goes further and says, every 7 years on the seventh year, that is the 50th year, there should be a jubilee, when all land claims get restored, when all enslaved people should be freed, when all debts are canceled, and things get restored to their proper and equitable state. Now, what was the text trying to accomplish? It was an understanding that over time, because of inequities, because of unfair systems, because of practices of servitude and in debt and falling into debt, and because of financial transactions and economic oppression, families, tribes, folks wind up in debt slavery, in physical servitude, and losing their land. And so the way in which the ancient biblical text rectified that was to say every 50 years, there is a reset. There is a restoration. People get their land back, people get their assets back, people get their lives back. So this global movement for reparations is very consistent with thousands of years of tradition, coming from this rooted idea that the earth is God's and that humanity is only temporary dwellers here. Its assets and its resources are to be shared with equity and with fairness. One final reflection before I give over the Zoom microphone. I also say all these words as a Jew, as a person who has family and direct descendants of the Holocaust. 6 million of our family were lost because of the genocide of the Shoah, of the Holocaust. And after the Holocaust, reparations were done. They were paid by Germany to the Jewish people in order to rebuild and reclaim their lives. And much like the debate about the beam, the house wasn't torn down. Nobody could actually restore the lives of the humans that were lost. But by paying equity and reparations to the Jewish descendants of the Holocaust, the Jewish community could rebuild itself. This is a reminder to us of the sacred way in which, if we can make space for teshuvah, healing is possible. I had the great honor of traveling to Germany and to Berlin to see for myself the way in which doing teshuvah and paying reparations enabled Germans to heal from the sin of Nazism. Everywhere you go in Berlin, you see reminders. This family lived here and was murdered here. This Jewish family was kidnapped here. This home belonged to a Jewish family. They have not run away from the sin of the Holocaust, but they have leaned into the opportunity for teshuvah and for reparations. So too with us. It is time for this country and this world to lean into the sins of our past by doing reparations and lifting up the people who will be the people of healing and hope for the future. End of sermon.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Pesner. So too with us. We are so grateful to have such a variety of faith traditions and communions that join together, recognizing that we are truly stronger together, and recognizing also that we have a lens that is very clear that this is what God calls us to do in God's good world. And world does mean world. And so I'm honored to call into this circle the Reverend Dr. Karen Georgia Thompson, who has been for me a mentor, who has been for many a sage and inspiring preacher, poet, and theologian, who I first met while she was the Minister for Racial Justice for the United Church of Christ. Afterwards, she went on to become the ecumenical and interfaith relations leader for the United Church of Christ. And then now she holds the esteemed position of Associate General Minister for wider church ministries and operations. But she is also the co-executive for the United Church of Christ, as well as the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, Global Ministries. She embodies a global lens. She does this naturally, if you will. It's not something that she does just to get a paycheck. She always sees the good in humanity and lives a life that is central in repairing so that all of God's children will have a future and a hope that we find in that Jeremiah text. So we are thankful that she will come today and what we call in church sometimes, break open the bread of life and help to make more connections for us in terms of our call to reparatory justice, bringing in her work with the World Council of Churches, her work with all of God's people, and weaving it together so that we can better understand the history as well as the present. Dr. Karen Georgia Thompson, welcome and thank you.
Thank you, Sakina, and thank you, Rabbi Pesner, for your able introduction to this topic. I could listen to you for probably about another 10 minutes, frame this out for us with just the theological words that we need to really build this foundation. I also just want to say thanks for the opportunity to be present with you all to talk about this particular subject. I also was on last time when Dr. Carruthers provided a beautiful presentation on this subject that was just deep and broad. And so my hope today is to add, not to be redundant, but to provide some other angles of looking at this particular topic so that we all together can lift every voice on this particular matter. And that's actually what I titled my presentation for today, Lift Every Voice. I want to start, as I often do, with poetry to frame the text for my time together with you. And the poem that I wanted to use, that I'm using today, is entitled Complicit. Measure the silence in beats of compassion. How long before you speak? The world needs your voice to speak while others weep. Silence is for those who sleep. Measure the silence in the breaths between their screams. How long before you hear the sounds of hearts breaking in defeat and despair? Silence is for those who don't care. Measure the silence in the depths of their teardrops. Another child dies in her mother's arms. Hunger gnaws at their bellies, no food for miles. Silence is for those spewing bile. Measure the silence in the heartbeats of the hopeless. Cry because you must, because your soul aches for justice, grasping at peace. No need for despair. Silence is for those who won't hear. Measure the silence in the syllables of repackaged truth. The system is abusive. Justice is elusive. Scream your truth. Run from hate and fear. Silence is for those who are living dead. Today, we want to talk some more about the reparatory justice movement. This is a global movement spanning many years, and particularly here, we are talking about the reparatory justice movement and compensation owed to Africans, African descendant peoples, and Indigenous peoples globally. Note here that I am naming Indigenous people in this context because the lives of the Indigenous people, particularly in the Americas, are intertwined with the lives of African people who were brought into the Americas as enslaved people. The colonial project interrupted and disrupted the lives of millions. And at the same time, I will name that the Africans who arrived in the Americas brought with them indigenous realities, which continue to define who we are as a people. An indigenous reality that is often demonized by other communities. The global movement is inclusive of the African diaspora. And while specific communities have reparatory justice foci based on their context, these are all intertwined in a history of colonialism and white supremacy, which was built on the use of faulty Christian theology. Christianity was complicit in the treatment and abuse of Africans and the indigenous peoples of the Americas. The harm done to communities needs to be addressed and redressed. There isn't enough prayer to repair the breach of relationship, the violation of human rights, and the negation of humanity of people that happened as a result of the transatlantic slave trade, the rise of plantations and a brutal plantocracy shrouded with Christianity as it prioritized whiteness. Reparatory justice is more than paying people. Reparatory justice, as Rabbi Pesner said, is more than equality. Reparatory justice is about equity, which rights the wrongs committed, ensuring that all have access, and where necessary, a level playing field is created. This level playing field is required to ensure that those communities that were wronged are able to experience repair, and those who profited from the harm done to others should compensate for that harm. We are being invited to lift every voice in this movement, to lift our voices in advocacy to ensure that justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. Silence is not an option. In June of 2020, as the COVID-19 health pandemic ravaged the world was exposed once again to the pandemic of racism. The death of George Floyd while in the custody of Minneapolis police was televised around the world. The incident was caught on video by several bystanders, and the world watched over and over and over again as the life of Mr. Floyd ebbed before our eyes, his breath taken from his body as a police officer knelt on his neck until he died. In the aftermath, African countries lobbied for the United Nations to set up a UN Commission of Inquiry into the systemic racism, police brutality, and human rights violations in the United States. This started as a specific action directed towards the United States and became a request for a global response because the matter was set to be considered by the UN Human Rights Council. And I and thousands of others watched, wrote letters, and watched as the United States threatened and really forced the African countries to withdraw their petition for the commission. The letter was amended and mostly weakened. References to the racism in the United States were amended and the message weakened. In the United States, over 600 organizations had also called for the United States, for the UN to launch this inquiry. I start with this story because there is a price to be paid for truth. There's a price to be paid for this work that we do. And there is a history that we cannot ignore as we continue to call for reparatory justice here in the United States and globally. So I want to start with the compensated, is what I want to call them. Let's talk about who got paid and who got paid what. And I want to start with Haiti. One would think that there would be accommodations made for the enslaved and individuals who had little resources and skills to ensure their livelihood when they were freed. That was not the case in the United States or in the global community. On January 1st of 1804, emancipation of enslaved people was declared in Haiti. This brought an end to almost 13 years of what folks want to call revolution, but I want to call 13 years of agency exercised by Africans in Haiti to achieve their emancipation from the French. The Haitians were the first group of enslaved people to be emancipated, not by a colonial power or a European government. They self-emancipated. Others call that a revolt. They self-emancipated, fought for their freedom, and declared themselves to be free. In an NPR article entitled "The Greatest Heist in History: How Haiti Was Forced to Pay Reparations for Freedom," Greg Rosalsky wrote, "Haiti won its independence from France in 1804 and was almost immediately made a pariah state by world powers. It was an independent, Black-led nation created by slaves, I want to call those enslaved people, who had cast aside their chains and fought their oppressors for their freedom during a time when white-led nations were enforcing brutal, racist systems of exploitation around the world." In the aftermath of the French Revolution, of the Haitian Revolution, the French demanded reparations. They demanded reparations from the newly created Black-led nation. And in 1825, 21 years after emancipation was declared on the island of Haiti, the French decided that they would recognize Haiti as a nation and demanded 100 million francs from the young nation. That is the equivalent of $21 billion today. It took 100 years for Haiti to pay that debt to the French. And let's be clear here in this conversation that Haiti paid its enslavers reparations. They paid France for their freedom. In fact, I would probably use the word ransom over reparations here to describe the criminality of the demand. Haiti fought for their freedom and won, paid the price demanded for their freedom by 1947, and continues to be punished as an island nation because they dared to defy whiteness and colonialism. That's a longer story for another day. Suffice it to say, there's a price for freedom. I submit to you that these reparations have been detrimental to Haiti, which is currently the poorest nation in the Western Hemisphere. I further submit to you that France owes Haiti $21 billion, which was imposed on Haiti, plus reparations for the years of enslavement of Africans in Haiti. The implications of $21 billion in the development of Haiti has been robbery and has been problematic to the development of Haiti. The United States was joined by other European countries in systematically oppressing and suppressing growth in Haiti. The bottom line, the Black people defeated the white people, and as a result, an entire nation of people has been punished because they dared to emancipate themselves. Let's jump across the pond, because somebody's going to tell me that the French and Haiti, those are just two countries in the midst of a global community. As Haiti went, so did the British colonies. Britain was a major colonizer in the Americas and also on the African continent. The extent of the part of the British in the enslavement of Africans is well documented, as is its occupation of these lands that we live on, that we call the United States of America. Their descendants in these climes fought for their independence, declaring this part of the United States of the Americas, the United States of America. Well, in August of 1833, the Slave Emancipation Act was passed, giving all enslaved persons in the British Empire their freedom. I have an investment here because I was born in Jamaica, so this is my issue right here. All enslaved persons were required after emancipation to serve 2 years of apprenticeship. What happened in those 2 years was that these slave owners got 2 additional years of free labor out of freed enslaved people because they couldn't figure out how to plant their land without free labor. So for 2 years, people labored on, which is very much akin to what happened in the United States after the Emancipation Proclamation, but I digress. Along with the 2 years of additional free labor granted to slave owners in British colonies, all slave owners were compensated by the British government to the tune of $20 million. 20 million pounds, excuse me. They borrowed the money from the British Treasury, you see, and they finally repaid that money in 2015. I'm talking about 7 years ago, they finished paying off the money that they borrowed to compensate slave owners for loss of property, for stealing people, for raping women, for selling children. They were compensated. But we can't figure out how to compensate people and their descendants for the free labor that supports much of the global economy. That sum, $20 million, is the equivalent of over 17 billion pounds in today's currency. 17 billion, which also means that the descendants of enslaved people who ended up in Britain also footed the bill for paying the enslavers of their ancestors. The enslaved got nothing. The families of slave owners, all 3,000 of them, have benefited from the receipt of these funds. And what was owed to the enslaved after emancipation, I would say a great debt that is owed. What is owed to the descendants of the enslaved, a great debt yet to be computed. I would also note here, for those who are interested, that the University of Central London has done a fantastic job of following the money. And what they have done is to document in the British colonies who got what money and where the plantations were. And they have actually tracked that through generations to track where the money went and who's owed what. There's a similar project here in the United States coming out of City College in New York. But that's foreign soil. Let's talk about the United States. On April 16th of 1862, the District of Columbia Compensated Emancipation Act became law. This law was enacted ahead of the Emancipation Proclamation which was signed January of 1863. Now, let's be clear that the Emancipation Proclamation was a presidential proclamation and executive order issued by President Abraham Lincoln, and we are grateful. The Compensated Emancipation Act was designed to compensate slave owners for their loss of property in the District of Columbia. According to the National Archives, each owner of an enslaved person immediately received $300 for every person that they owned. So, ahead of the Emancipation Proclamation, they were compensated so that they would not fight over the proclamation when it was signed, and even so, they still stole time from emancipated people. Listen to this from the document from the National Archives. On April 16, 1862, President Abraham Lincoln signed a bill ending slavery in the District of Columbia. Passage of this law came 8.5 months before President Lincoln issued his Emancipation Proclamation. The act brought to a conclusion decades of agitation aimed at ending what anti-slavery advocates call the national shame of slavery in the nation's capital. It provided for immediate emancipation, compensation to former owners who were loyal to the Union of up to $300 for each freed slave, voluntary colonization of former slaves to locations outside the United States, and payments of up to $100 for each person choosing immigration. Over the next 9 months, the Board of Commissioners appointed to administer the act approved 930 petitions, completely or in part, from former owners for the freedom of 2,989 former slaves. That's the shame and disgrace, that people were compensated in the midst of a conversation about reparations. Is the silence and the complicity about a history of payments made to slave owners so that they would participate in the emancipation of enslaved people. And in the midst of this conversation is the silence and the complicity that then says that the price that is being required as payment for reparations is too high. But there was no payment too high for slave owners who wanted to compensate for what they did not own, because it is not possible to own the life of a person. So let's talk about reparations. I want to start with the conversation about 40 acres and a mule. 40 acres and a mule is one of those things that's been out there as promised, right? And really, the question about 40 acres and a mule came out of conversation with between General William T. Sherman and Black ministers in Savannah, Georgia. So in that particular story, what was promised was 40 acres, up to 40 acres to each freed slave. It was a promise that was never kept. A promise that continues to linger. And I want to point back to that because that could have been reparations, but it was not. That could have provided enslaved people here in the United States with a beginning, land ownership that would say that they had something. Instead, enslaved people walked away with nothing, while white people were compensated for the wrong that they did. So from this special field order number 15 came the term 40 acres and a mule, and with it, the unrealized dream for providing freed Africans and African descendant people with any kind of restitution following enslavement. HR 40, which is actually the Commission to Study and Develop Reparation Proposals for African Americans Act, was created to address the fundamental injustice, and this comes straight from the bill, was created to address the fundamental injustice, cruelty, brutality, and inhumanity of slavery in the United States and the 13 American colonies between 1619 and 1865, and to establish a commission to study and consider a national apology and a national apology and proposal for reparations for the institution of slavery, its subsequent de jure and de facto racial and economic discrimination against African Americans, and the impact of these forces on living African Americans, to make recommendations to the Congress on appropriate remedies and for purposes. Here's the thing, most people may not recognize it. The United States has never apologized for the enslavement of Africans in this country. It has barely acknowledged its part and its role in the history of Africans in the Americas. If we want to talk reparation, let's talk about apology. Let's talk about acknowledgement, because that has to be a part of the process. So that too is a part of this conversation. The bill itself identifies approximately 4 million Africans and their descendants were enslaved in the United States. Not that anybody was really counting, nor do we account for the millions who died in the Middle Passages. And the bill itself, in its construct, lays a firm case for restitution and for reparations. HR 40 is a beginning. It's a beginning, and it calls on the United States to account for its part in the enslavement and violation of the human rights of African people. The bill would establish a federal commission to examine the impacts of slavery in the United States and provide proposals for reparations. A comprehensive reparations plan moves beyond money and looks at development, looks at ways in which society needs to address the gaps which exist for African descendant people, and has to examine the structural racism that continues to be a barrier to equity and equality for African descendant people in this country. Black people in the United States and around the world continue to feel the impacts of slavery today in the form of structural racism, violence, health disparities, housing, education, economics, policing, law enforcement. The list goes on and on. From the tip of North America all the way down to South America, we are seeing these problems. These are not unique to the United States and are at the heart of the global reparations movement. Now, as I mentioned before, I am Jamaican. I was born in Jamaica, and I am thankful for the years that I've spent here in the United States, and for the years that I've also spent as a part of the global reparations movement. I want to introduce you to the CARICOM 10-point reparations plan. The CARICOM plan for reparations is one that I often talk about when I talk about reparatory justice, because I believe that this plan and the way it's written speaks to what the comprehensive nature of reparations needs to look like. Quite often, those who are anti-reparations have narratives that talk about how much money it's going to cost, how much money we're going to be giving to people, but that's not what a comprehensive reparations plan is about. It is more than that. So I want to introduce you to the CARICOM plan. And CARICOM refers to the Caribbean community, which is primarily made up of the group of islands in the Caribbean, and also some of the countries in the northern tip of South America. So just about down to Suriname. Okay, so here's what it calls for. The first is for a full formal apology. And this is one of the things that is also being called for with HR 40, an apology. The healing process for victims and the descendants of the enslaved and enslavers requires as a precondition the offer of a sincere formal apology by the governments of Europe. And again, this is in the Caribbean context. Some governments, in refusing to offer an apology, have issued in place statements of regrets. Little insulting, but there you have it. The second is repatriation. Over 10 million Africans were stolen from their homes and forcibly transported to the Caribbean as the enslaved chattel and property of Europeans. The transatlantic slave trade is the largest forced migration in human history and has no parallels in terms of man's inhumanity to man, and I would say people's inhumanity to people, because there were women who were also a part of this. So they're calling for a repatriation program, which must be established and all available channels of international law and diplomacy used to resettle those people who wish to return. The third, which is important for me, is the inclusion of Indigenous Peoples Development Program, because in the Caribbean, in the Americas, in every place where there were where enslaved Africans were present, there were Indigenous people for whom genocide was a part of their lives. Here in the United States, on these lands, we no longer even know who some of the occupiers of the land are, because they have been decimated. And those who are left have been put on reservations. Genocide and land appropriation went hand in hand. That's how they got the land. A community of over 3 million in 1700 has been reduced to less than 30,000 in 2000. That's what happened to Indigenous people in the Caribbean. Cultural institutions. European nations have invested in the development of community institutions such as museums and research centers in order to prepare their citizens for an understanding of these crimes against humanity. These facilities serve to reinforce within the consciousness of their citizens an understanding of their role in history as rulers and change agents. There are no such institutions in the Caribbean where crimes against humanity were committed. Caribbean school teachers and researchers do not have the same opportunity. It is important to be able to tell the stories and to carry the narratives of what happened to the Black ancestors in the process of engagement in the transatlantic slave trade. So funds for cultural institutions becomes important. The health crisis. African descendant people in the Caribbean have the highest incidence in the world of chronic diseases in the form of hypertension and type 2 diabetes. May I add here, that's a problem here in the United States. This pandemic is the direct result of the nutritional experience, physical and emotional brutality, and overall stress profiles associated with slavery, genocide, and apartheid. This is what's affecting our communities, and the need to provide resources into addressing health disparities is tremendously important. Illiteracy eradication. Listen to this. At the end of the European colonial period in most parts of the Caribbean, the British in particular left the Black and Indigenous communities in a general state of illiteracy. Some 70% of Blacks in British colonies were functionally illiterate in the 1960s when nation states began to appear. If you don't have a community that is empowered through literacy to provide the foundation for technology, then you don't have the resources that are needed for development. So illiteracy and the eradication of illiteracy, knowledge programs, this is also important. And this kind of goes with the literacy piece, because a lot of us don't know where we come from. African knowledge program, the forced separation of Africans from their homeland has resulted in cultural and social alienation from identity and essential belonging. Psychological rehabilitation, technology transfer, and last but not least, debt cancellation. All of these, and I raise this because when we talk about reparations, it is important for us to name what a comprehensive reparations program looks like. It is not just about money and giving people money. It is about doing the things that are necessary to correct the wrongs and having the resources to do that. So these things take resources, whether it is to create museums or knowledge recovery programs or any of that. It requires resources because they don't just come by themselves. In closing, I just want to point to the UN International Decade for People of African Descent. The UN has identified 200 million people in the Americas who are descendants of enslaved people, 200 million. And for these 200 million people, we need to continue to seek redress. And we need to continue to speak to not just what's going on in our context, but to actually have a global framework when we talk contextually about the issues that we're addressing here in the United States. Thank you.
Wow, that's the first word that comes to mind. Incredible presentations from Rabbi Pesner, Reverend Dr. Karen Georgia Thompson. He just blew my socks off. I would ask if we can to edit 3-minute introduction promotional pieces from Rabbi Pesner and Reverend Dr. Thompson that we can get out to social media immediately. These presentations, everybody needs to hear them around the world. I want to thank both of you for being here with us, and I will open it up to questions and answers. If you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A feature in Zoom.
I do see one question coming up from Claudia Douglas Smith, asking if it's a good idea to include a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in the reparations study. Does someone want to reflect on that question?
I'm certainly willing to. I think that Truth and Reconciliation, a Truth and Reconciliation Commission is going to be important. But I think that Truth and Reconciliation comes after apology and acknowledgement. I think too often the posture has been open forgiveness or an expectation of forgiveness from people who are wronged with no acknowledgement from those who have imposed oppression on individuals. So communities apologize. We move into truth and reconciliation. There are, outcomes, and never an acknowledgement. So for me, personal opinion is that yes, there eventually needs to be a truth and reconciliation commissions as a part of the reparations movement here in the United States, but that actually needs to come after there has been some of the foundational work done here in the United States and globally, because there are also multiple European countries that have not, well, actually, let me take that back. None of them have acknowledged their part, and there have been no apologies issued to date around enslavement of African peoples.
Thank you for that. I don't see any more questions or in the Q&A box. Reverend Dr. Thompson, is there something that you would like to leave us on before we go to our call to action?
The one thing that I would say is that it is important for us here in the United States to carry the global narrative as a part of the conversation about reparations. What's happening here in the United States is not isolated. The history of enslavement of African people here in the United States is not isolated. And we need to carry that truth about the descendants, the 200 million people here in the Americas. We need to carry the truth, not just about the 4 million people who were enslaved here in the United States, but about the 12 million ancestors who were 12 to 15 million who were taken off the African continent. We need to carry the stories of the men, women, and children who drowned in the Atlantic Ocean. The Atlantic Ocean is a huge burial ground, carrying millions of people in her sands and in her waters. And one of the last things that I also do want to mention for us is that we need to also continue to be a part of the Zacchaeus Tax Project and to learn about that. And I know that Reverend Sakina Hamlin is actually a huge supporter of that work, which is currently going on in our communities. And the Zacchaeus tax is also about equity and repair. It is about addressing, and Reverend Sakina, if you could drop into the chat some information about the Zacchaeus tax project, I think that would be helpful, because it calls for equity in terms of the taxation of wealthy individuals as a way of addressing the issues that are present for poorer communities and poor countries.
Thank you, Reverend Thompson. I spoke too soon. There is another question. I think you covered a little of this in your presentation, but the question is, do you see any signs of beginning this process?
So I think that HR 40 is an excellent beginning. The CARICOM plan is an excellent beginning. The work that is coming out of the Africa Union and the Africa Union recognizing this region as the 6th region is also a beginning. I think what becomes a little bit more challenging is the lack of response from European countries and the ongoing resistance of European descendant people in calling for action around reparations because of the inherent fears around loss of financial resources. So those become problematic in the movement towards reparations.
Thank you so much. I have to just say once again, you are a treasure. I appreciate everything that you said today. That was an incredible presentation. Please take the opportunity to share it with your family and friends and watch it again. There was so much information shared that I don't think you could digest it all in one setting. So now I will turn it to my colleagues, and they will give us a call to action. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. Ms. Colvin, you're on mute.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Let's see if I can do this really well. Okay, the first thing I would really like for us to do is to breathe. We've heard some very compelling information here today, and breathing is necessary. So let's just take a very cleansing breath. Thank you, Jared, for leading into this. I want to, in this moment, also, before we go any further, to offer up the elemental gifts with the power of fire, the fluidity of water, the grounding of earth, and the air through you. I compel you and call you to action. Call your representative at the number that you see listed here and tell them to pass HR 40. Tell them to pass that it is called the Commission to Study and Develop Reparations Proposals for African Americans Act. Tell your representative that the devastating effects on people of African descent cannot be ignored. Tell them and use the 10-point CARICON plan for reparatory justice, that the time is now. And speaking of time, to tell them that we as a country need to lean into our sins of the past and speak to the need for jubilee that is real time and, of course, about time. I would like to leave you with this. You can also hashtag Zacchaeus Tax as well. If you Google that, you will see a wealth of information regarding the Zacchaeus Tax for Justice. But I would like to also leave you with this. Globally, there should be a reset economically and a cultural equation that dismantles racism. Globally, repair the breach. Globally, repair the damage. Globally, create safe and liberated spaces that reclaim ancestral memory and that are no longer complicit and quiet. Recall. Recall is sacred memory, the looking back into history, viewing the present in light of what has happened, and it has come to understood, and looks into the future to bring it into focus, hope, and faith. Jubilee as well. With intention, recall the seeds that have been given here and are waiting for harvest. And the harvest is a release. We have been released to share this information, and call your representatives at the number you see on the corner of your screen. Attune. With this kind of activism, take moments to check within your bodies. Do a body scan and see where you are tense, where you're tight, and where you have moments of neutrality, then do the needful being drink water, be refreshed. And once you've seen to yourself, take awareness to others. Consider all of those who do not have access to this information that you have gleaned here today, and share it. Share the phone number that you see in the corner of your screen. Share with the people that the HR 40 is called the Commission to Study and Develop Reparation Proposals for African Americans Act. Consider telling them about the 10-point CARICOM plan for reparatory justice. And let us not forget to also, across your social medias, to hashtag #ZachTax. And with ethical engagement, remember that there is a woman by the name of Marie Claude who wrote a compelling essay on reverse missions. Reverse missions says that we don't go into a particular community and tell them what they need. We allow them to tell us how we can help them. So no one should tell us what reparations look like. They need to come to us, and we can point them to the 10-point CARICOM plan, to HR 40, and tell them to get this bill passed. With all of that, yes, it spells out grace. Now, it's not the cheap grace, but it is a grace that is holistic, and it looks for transformative, and it follows the ritual journey of acknowledgement, healing, transformation, and remediation. So here, in this moment, in this time, thank you all very much for joining us today. It will be up on our various different outlets this evening at 7:00 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. It will be on the National Council of Churches website, so you can go ahead and share that information and pass it along, share their website. And that's it. So may the divine wonder, the one who creates all things, sustain worlds and universes, who is full of abundance and completeness, and is transcendently immanent, be the downbeat of your stride towards reparatory justice. May the eternal wonder grant favor and peace to our guests who were here speaking today. We are so grateful for them and their attendance. May the comforting warmth of our ancestors bring transformative refreshing in our hands and in our feet and our hearts. We affirm their guidance, love, positive innovations, and grace their thoughts bring. With goodness and mercy as our rear guards, may our paths be illumined by the same eternal wonder to make our way safe, easy, successful, peaceful, prosperous, abundant, joyful, and remediated our way. In that name, I pray. Ashe, Ashe, Ashe. Oh, thank you.